One of the real turning points of World War II was not caused by a new weapon, a famous general, or a secret machine. It was caused by a mistake that everyone could see, and no one thought mattered. Floating trash. At first glance, it sounds ridiculous. But if you follow this story to the end, you'll understand how something so ordinary quietly rewrote the logic of submarine warfare and helped reverse the Battle of the Atlantic. This isn't a legend, it isn't speculation, and it isn't a metaphor. It's a documented chain of decisions. How trained, rational commanders were pushed into predictable behavior, and how that predictability became fatal. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because this story isn't really about garbage or even about submarines. It's about the kind of hidden causes that actually change wars, and why most people never notice them until it's too late. In early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was being lost on paper. Not slowly, not ambiguously, but mathematically. Every month, Allied merchant ships were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Fuel, food, ammunition, everything Britain needed to stay in the war had to cross the ocean. And across that ocean waited German submarines. They were not reckless. They were not improvising. They were executing a system. German U-boat commanders followed doctrine that had been refined through years of success. Attack at night. Strike convoys where escort coverage thinned. Dive deep once detected. Turn perpendicular. Run silent. Wait. Survive. It worked. Again and again. For Allied escort crews, the experience was brutally repetitive. Sonar contact, high-speed approach, depth charges released, then silence. The echo vanished. The ocean swallowed the enemy whole. The problem wasn't courage. It wasn't effort. It wasn't even intelligence. The Allies had broken German codes. They knew patrol zones. They rerouted convoys. They anticipated wolf-pack concentrations. And still, when ships actually met submarines at sea, the result was usually the same. The submarine escaped. By March 1943, this pattern had become so reliable that both sides trusted it. German commanders believed that once they executed standard evasion procedures, survival was likely. Allied officers believed that killing a submerged submarine required luck more than skill. That shared belief shaped every decision that followed. Then, something changed. Not in shipyards, not in laboratories, not in command rooms filled with maps and flags. The change came from something so ordinary that no tactical manual discussed it. Waste, food scraps, bread crusts, vegetable peelings, floating debris that sailors had been dumping into the ocean since ships first crossed it. At sea, trash was considered irrelevant. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a signal. It wasn't information. But war doesn't care what doctrine ignores. Because while Allied commanders were focused on detecting submarines, German commanders were focused on avoiding pursuit. And both sides were making the same assumption that visible evidence always pointed to real intent. In other words, if something appeared on the surface, it must mean something below was acting rationally. That assumption would prove fatal. What follows in this story is not a dramatic invention, or a lucky coincidence, or a one-time trick. It is a documented chain of decisions made by trained professionals doing exactly what they were taught to do. No one panicked. No one broke protocol. No one acted irrationally. And that is precisely why the system collapsed. Once debris on the surface began influencing how commanders interpreted danger, submarine warfare quietly shifted from a contest of machines into a contest of psychology. Escorts stopped reacting. They started predicting. Submarines stopped hiding. They started following expectations written years earlier. The ocean didn't change. The submarines didn't change. The escorts didn't suddenly become smarter. What changed was understanding. Understanding how the enemy interpreted uncertainty. Understanding how doctrine shaped instinct. Understanding that once you could influence those instincts, you no longer needed to chase the submarine. You could let it destroy itself. Most histories of the Battle of the Atlantic credit technology. Radar, aircraft, code breaking. All of them mattered. But they don't explain why, in a matter of weeks, German submarines began dying in numbers no one had predicted, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes without ever seeing the ship that killed them. To understand that shift, You don't start with weapons. You start with something everyone saw, everyone dismissed, and no one believed could matter: floating trash. Understand why a handful of small decisions could reshape the Atlantic War. You first have to understand how hopeless the situation looked from the surface of the ocean. On paper, Allied escorts were doing almost everything right. They sailed in organized convoys. They maintained constant sonar watch. They responded aggressively to every contact. And yet, time after time, the result was the same. The submarine slipped away. This wasn't because sonar was useless. Early sonar systems could detect a submerged submarine under good conditions at considerable range. The problem came next. To attack, an escort ship had to drive directly over the contact and drop depth charges. The moment it did, sonar contact was lost. The attacking ship created its own blind zone. Water turbulence, engine noise, and the ship's speed erased more or less erased the submarine from the screen. For a brief window, often less than a minute, the submarine was effectively invisible. German commanders were trained to exploit this moment perfectly. They would dive deeper, turn 90 degrees, slow to a crawl, and wait. By the time the escort circled back, the target was gone, not destroyed, not damaged, simply elsewhere. Allied officers knew this. They wrote about it in after-action reports. They complained about it in private letters. They described the same pattern again and again: contact, attack, disappearance. Killing a submarine felt less like skill and more like chance. Worse still, German submarines were built to survive exactly this kind of pursuit. Their pressure hulls could withstand depths beyond the effective range of most standard depth charges. Their internal layout absorbed shock. Their crews were trained to sit in darkness and silence for hours. For the men inside Allied escort ships, this created a psychological grind. They would watch a merchant ship explode in fire and oil. They would rescue survivors from freezing water. Then they would hunt the attacker and fail, again and again and again. By early 1943, this experience had hardened into belief. Allied commanders believed that once a submarine dove deep and ran silent, there was very little they could do. German commanders believed the same thing. Survival doctrine wasn't just effective, it was trusted. That trust shaped behavior on both sides. German U-boat captains did not see themselves as reckless attackers. They saw themselves as disciplined professionals. Their manuals emphasized patience, calm, obedience to procedure. If detected, break contact and live to attack again. And statistically, this made sense. A submarine was an enormous investment. It carried a highly trained crew and represented years of industrial effort. No commander was expected to sacrifice it unnecessarily. Doctrine existed to preserve the force. The Allies, meanwhile, built their tactics around this assumption. They believed that once detected, a submarine would prioritize survival over aggression, that it would disengage, dive, and escape. Escort doctrine was designed to chase, harass, and drive the enemy away, not necessarily to kill it. This created a strange equilibrium. Submarines attacked convoys. Escorts responded. Submarines escaped. The battle continued, but nothing fundamentally changed. Even intelligence breakthroughs couldn't fully break this cycle. Allied codebreakers could read enemy communications. They could predict patrol areas. They could reroute convoys to safer waters. But tactical combat, the moment ships and submarines encountered each other, still followed the same script. Everyone was operating rationally. Everyone was following rules that had been proven to work. And that was the real problem. Because rational systems create patterns. And patterns, once understood, can be manipulated. By early 1943, German commanders trusted their doctrine so completely that they stopped questioning it. Allied commanders trusted it too, they simply viewed it from the opposite side. Both sides believed submarines would behave predictably under pressure. No one asked what would happen if that predictability itself became a vulnerability. No one considered that a commander doing everything correctly might be easier to defeat than one improvising wildly. The Atlantic War was stuck because both sides were playing the same mental game, one built on assumptions that had never been seriously challenged. The ocean was vast. The submarines were hidden. The escorts were exhausted. And yet, beneath the surface, The battle was no longer about who had better ships or better weapons. It was about who understood the invisible rules guiding every decision. The breakthrough would not come from increasing force. It would come from changing interpretation, from taking something everyone saw, everyone ignored, and everyone misread, and turning it into a question no doctrine had ever prepared commanders to answer. 1943. Both sides in the Atlantic believed they understood the war. German commanders believed they had mastered it. Allied commanders believed they were enduring it. Neither realized that the same belief was quietly setting a trap. German submarine doctrine was built on success, not theory, experience. Hundreds of patrols had proven that discipline saved lives. Dive deep, reduce speed, eliminate noise. Wait until the surface ships exhausted themselves. The procedure worked because escorts behaved predictably. They rushed to the last known contact. They dropped depth charges in preset patterns. They circled back and searched where the submarine used to be. German commanders learned to read these reactions like a script. Once the escorts committed to the chase, the danger passed. Survival was no longer uncertain, it was procedural. This created confidence, not arrogance, but trust. Trust in training. Trust in doctrine. Trust that correct behavior led to survival. On the Allied side, a different but equally powerful belief took hold. Escort commanders believed submarines were fundamentally defensive once detected, that the moment a U-boat was found, it would stop thinking offensively and focus entirely on escape. And for years, this assumption held true. Submarines that stayed alive could attack again. Submarines that took risks often didn't come back. Rational commanders learned the lesson quickly, so the Allies adapted their thinking around it. The goal was not necessarily destruction, it was denial. Drive the submarine away, break the attack, protect the convoy. This mutual understanding created a strange stability in the middle of a violent war. Each side believed the other would behave correctly. I am boasting, and that belief hardened into expectation. The danger of expectations is not that they are wrong, it's that they stop being questioned. By early 1943, German commanders were no longer just following doctrine, they were relying on it emotionally. It reduced uncertainty. It offered control in an environment that otherwise felt chaotic and hostile. When detection occurred, the decision-making process narrowed. There were fewer choices, less hesitation, less doubt. Doctrine simplified fear. The same thing happened on Allied ships. Escort crews, worn down by months of fruitless hunts, learned to interpret certain outcomes as normal. Losing contact was expected. Escapes were expected. Success, when it happened, felt exceptional rather than repeatable. This bred a quiet resignation, not defeatism, professionalism. The job was to follow procedure, protect the convoy, and move on. The submarine war felt like a force of nature rather than a solvable problem. But forces of nature don't follow rules. People do, and the more strictly those rules are followed, the easier they become to anticipate. Neither side noticed what this mutual trust in doctrine was doing. German commanders were becoming easier to predict, not because they were careless, but because they were consistent. Allied escorts were becoming easier to manipulate, not because they were slow, but because they responded correctly every time. The war at sea was no longer just about detection and evasion. It was about interpretation, about what commanders believed certain signals meant. A sonar contact meant pursuit. A depth charge meant danger. Silence meant safety. These meanings were learned, reinforced, and rarely challenged. But what if a signal didn't mean what it appeared to mean? What if something visible didn't reflect intention, only expectation? Doctrine taught commanders how to respond to threats, not how to question the information those threats were based on. It assumed the enemy acted logically, transparently, and consistently. That assumption worked until someone realized it could be exploited. The irony was brutal. The German Navy had invested enormous effort into training commanders to behave rationally under pressure. The Allies had spent years learning how to counter that rational behavior. Both sides believed they were adapting. In reality, they were locking themselves into a shared mental framework. By spring 1943, submarine warfare had reached a point where outcomes were no longer driven primarily by technology or firepower. They were driven by belief. Belief about what the enemy would do next. Belief about what mattered. about what could be safely ignored. No one was cheating. No one was improvising wildly. Everyone was doing their job well. And that was the final condition required for the system to break. Because once a system becomes rigid enough, it doesn't need to be attacked head-on. It only needs to be nudged. The change that followed did not begin as a plan to deceive. It didn't come from a doctrine committee or a strategic conference. It came from noticing a detail that Doctrine had trained everyone to overlook, not because it was hidden, but because it seemed too trivial to matter. The idea did not begin as a tactic. It did not arrive in a briefing room. It was not written into a manual. And it was not proposed by someone whose job was to think strategically. It began as an irritation on a submarine thousands of miles from the Atlantic, far from convoy routes and wolf packs. Life followed a rhythm defined by routine, watch rotations, engine checks, torpedo maintenance, meals prepared in cramped galleys where efficiency mattered more than comfort. Everything had a procedure, including waste. Food scraps were collected, sealed, and expelled through systems designed to keep the submarine hidden. The assumption was simple. Once discarded, waste no longer mattered. It was background noise in an environment where only sonar contacts and periscope sightings counted. No doctrine suggested otherwise. But war has a habit of rewarding attention, not rank. Someone noticed something small, not during combat, not during a crisis, but during repetition. Enemy ships behaved differently after certain moments. Courses changed, search patterns shifted, escorts moved as if responding to information the submarine crew believed they had concealed. At first, this seemed impossible. Submarines were designed to disappear. Everything about their operation revolved around invisibility. Noise was controlled. Light was restricted. Movement was calculated. The ocean itself was supposed to erase traces, yet something kept leaking through. The initial reaction was dismissal, coincidence, overinterpretation, pattern seeking where none existed. Professional skepticism was not only expected, it was encouraged, but the observation persisted. It didn't align with enemy skill. It didn't align with technology. It aligned with timing. Certain actions preceded enemy reactions with uncomfortable consistency. The insight did not come packaged as an answer. It came as a question. What if something we think vanishes? Doesn't? What if something considered irrelevant isn't? This was not a tactical revelation. It was an observational one, and that distinction mattered. Military doctrine is excellent at explaining what to do. It is less effective at explaining what to notice. The person who raised the question had no authority to redefine tactics. He wasn't trained to analyze naval warfare at a strategic level. He didn't speak in the language of doctrine or theory, but he paid attention. He noticed that certain materials floated longer than expected, that they spread differently depending on speed and direction, that they created shapes on the surface, shapes that persisted, shapes that could be read. At first, the idea sounded absurd. Food waste as information? Trash as a signal? The concept violated instinct. Waste was supposed to disappear. That belief was deeply embedded, not just in naval practice, but in common sense. And that is why it was dangerous. Because no one had trained commanders to question it. Once the possibility was acknowledged, even tentatively, the implications began to stack up, not as conclusions, but as uncomfortable hypotheticals. If debris remained visible, then it could reveal timing. If it spread predictably, then it could reveal direction. If it lingered, then it could reveal behavior. And if it could reveal those things accidentally, then in theory, it could reveal them deliberately. This wasn't a plan yet. It wasn't even a proposal. It was a crack in certainty. The next step was not innovation. It was verification. Small tests, controlled conditions, observations repeated, patterns compared. No heroics, no dramatic maneuvers, just attention. What emerged was not a weapon, but a realization. Information did not need to be transmitted intentionally to be interpreted. It only needed to exist in a form the enemy already believed they understood. Enemy commanders were trained to interpret the surface. Oil slicks, debris, disturbances. These were clues, evidence of damage, evidence of pursuit. Doctrine told them how to read those clues. What doctrine did not prepare them for was the idea that those clues could be meaningless or worse, misleading. At this stage, nothing had changed in the Atlantic. German submarines were still sinking ships. Allied escorts were still struggling to convert detection into destruction, but a conceptual shift had begun. How to fight submarines, but in how submarines and escorts thought about each other. The realization was subtle. If you could influence interpretation, you didn't need to overpower the enemy. You only needed to guide their decisions. This was not deception in the traditional sense. No false radio messages, no fake signals, no elaborate ruses. It was simpler. Let the enemy see exactly what they expected to see. Let them draw the conclusions Doctrine had trained them to draw, and then act somewhere else. The idea still sounded too simple to matter. That was its strength. Complex tactics invite scrutiny. Simple ones slip through because they appear obvious. No one looks closely at what they believe they already understand. The leap from observation to application did not happen instantly. It required a certain kind of command environment, one willing to tolerate ideas that sounded wrong. Not reckless, not desperate, but curious. And that curiosity would soon travel across oceans. From a single submarine's routine to reports shared, copied, questioned, and finally read by commanders who had run out of alternatives. By the time the idea reached the Atlantic, it had not been framed as genius. It had been framed as possibility. A possibility that challenged a foundational belief of submarine warfare. That what floats on the surface tells the truth about what hides below. That belief had guided thousands of decisions, and once it was questioned, the war at sea entered a phase no one had trained for. Because the moment commanders stopped reacting to reality and started reacting to interpretation, the balance began to shift. The next step would test whether this insight could survive contact with the most disciplined submarine force in the world, and whether something as ordinary as trash could force trained professionals into exactly the behavior their enemies needed. When the idea crossed from observation into intent, it stopped being ridiculous. It became dangerous, because once something can be measured, it can be predicted. And once it can be predicted, it can be shaped. The key insight was not that debris floated. Sailors had always known that. The insight was that debris behaved consistently. Bread crusts stayed buoyant longer than expected. Vegetable peelings spread outward in recognizable patterns. Grease and oil created thin films that lingered on the surface. And together, these fragments formed something commanders had never been trained to look for. A timeline. Floating waste didn't just exist, it aged. Fresh debris meant recent activity. Dispersed debris meant movement. Elongated patterns hinted at direction and speed. Individually, none of this mattered. Collectively, it told a story. To an enemy trained to read the ocean for clues, debris wasn't meaningless. It was evidence. Evidence that something had happened recently, somewhere nearby. Doctrine had taught commanders how to interpret that evidence, and that doctrine could be used against them. The realization was simple, but unsettling. If enemy commanders already trusted surface clues, then those clues didn't need to be truthful. They only needed to be convincing. At this point, the concept still wasn't about deception. It was about influence. Enemy decisions followed predictable logic. A visible sign suggested a recent presence. A recent presence suggested pursuit. Pursuit suggested danger. Commanders responded not to certainty, but to probability. And probability could be manipulated. Once this was understood, the question changed. Not, does this work? We're musting in Pruses. But what does this force the enemy to believe? He said, tests confirmed what observation had hinted at. Floating debris could be seen from aircraft at altitude. It could be spotted by surface lookouts. It could be correlated with sonar contact timing. Most importantly, it could be misread. If debris appeared in one place, it suggested activity there, even if the submarine or ship had already moved elsewhere. That misinterpretation mattered because of how submarines and escorts reacted under pressure. German submarine commanders had been trained to assume that surface evidence reflected real pursuit. When they believed escorts were closing in, they executed deep, evasive maneuvers. They slowed down. They conserved power. They waited. All logical decisions, all survivable decisions, and all decisions that limited their options. At extreme depth, submarines became cautious. They couldn't maneuver aggressively. They couldn't verify surface activity. They couldn't easily reposition without exposing themselves. They were safe, but constrained. That constraint was the opening. If debris could push a commander into deep, defensive behavior, it didn't need to destroy the submarine directly. It only needed to place it somewhere predictable. The enemy would do the rest. This was the moment trash stopped being waste and started becoming data. Data about timing. Data about movement. Data about expectation. The genius of the idea was not that it created a false trail. Humans had been doing that for thousands of years. The genius was that it exploited professional discipline. German commanders were not careless. They were trained. They trusted their doctrine because it had kept them alive. They believed they were interpreting the ocean correctly. And, in most cases, they were, until they weren't. Once the implications were understood, the tactic revealed its true power. It didn't require perfect execution. It didn't require surprise every time. It didn't even require the enemy to believe completely. It only required them to believe enough. Enough to commit. Enough to dive. Enough to wait. Because waiting was exactly what made them vulnerable. At depth, submarines were blind. Above them, the surface battle could be choreographed. This was no longer about chasing contacts. It was about shaping reactions. The enemy saw debris and assumed pursuit. They responded by diving deeper. They slowed. They waited. And in doing so, they removed themselves from the dynamic fight. They became static, predictable, targetable. The brilliance of the tactic lay in its asymmetry. The side deploying debris risked almost nothing. The side reacting to it risked everything. If the enemy suspected deception, Doctrine offered no alternative. Ignoring surface evidence was dangerous. Surfacing to confirm was riskier. Continuing aggressive action while believing escorts were nearby violated every instinct of survival. So commanders chose safety, and safety became the trap. This is why the tactic spread so quickly once its implications were understood. Not because it was clever, but because it was devastatingly compatible with existing beliefs. No new behavior was required from the enemy, only the continuation of old ones. The ocean remained the same, the ships remained the same, the submarines remained the same, but interpretation had shifted. The battle had moved from detection to expectation. At this stage, nothing about the tactic guaranteed destruction. It only created opportunity. Opportunity to reposition. Opportunity to coordinate. Opportunity to strike where the enemy no longer expected contact. The decisive question now was whether this idea could survive contact with reality not in controlled conditions, but in the chaos of the Atlantic, against multiple submarines operating together. Could something this simple scale? Could something so ordinary survive the stress of real combat? That answer would come soon. And when it did, it would expose just how fragile the foundations of submarine warfare had become. Foundations built not on technology, but on belief. The real test of the idea didn't happen in a laboratory. It happened in uncertainty. At sea, nothing works the way it does on paper. Currents shift. Weather interferes. Crews misinterpret signals. And most new ideas fail not because they are wrong, but because they collapse under pressure. This one didn't. What changed was not a single engagement, but a pattern of behavior. Once surface debris began influencing decisions, German submarines started responding in ways Allied commanders had never been able to force before. Not because they were outmaneuvered, but because they were persuaded. The sequence became familiar. Debris appeared on the surface. Commanders interpreted it as evidence of recent pursuit. They dove deeper. They slowed down. They waited. From the German perspective, this was correct behavior. From the Allied perspective, it was a gift. Deep-running submarines were safer, but they were also constrained. At depth, speed dropped. Maneuvering options narrowed. Situational awareness vanished. Most importantly, deep submarines could no longer verify what was happening above them. They had surrendered initiative. That surrender changed everything. Instead of racing to attack a fleeting contact, Allied escorts could now reposition deliberately. They no longer had to react immediately. They could coordinate. They could anticipate where the submarine would be, not where it had been. This was the decisive shift. For years, anti-submarine warfare had been reactive. Escorts chased echoes. They dropped charges where contact used to be. They guessed. Now they could plan. The moment a submarine committed to deep evasion, its future options collapsed into a narrow corridor of behavior. It could move slowly. It could wait. Or it could risk surfacing into perceived danger. None of those choices favored survival. What made this tactic so powerful was that it didn't rely on precision. It relied on pressure. German commanders didn't need to be fooled completely. They only needed to believe that the risk of staying shallow was higher than the risk of diving deep. Doctrine had trained them to make that calculation automatically. And once made, it locked them into predictability. Allied commanders noticed the change almost immediately. Submarines weren't slipping away as often. Contacts didn't vanish unpredictably. Instead, they settled into deeper layers of the ocean and stayed there. From the surface, this looked like caution. From a tactical standpoint, it was paralysis. Once the enemy was pinned deep, escorts could bring in specialized weapons designed for exactly this scenario. Weapons that had existed before, but had rarely been decisive. They could hold contact while other ships moved into position. They could attack from multiple angles. They could force the submarine to choose between depth and mobility. This wasn't brute force. It was exploitation. The irony was sharp. German submarines had always been most dangerous when aggressive stalking convoys, choosing their moment, dictating the terms of engagement. Now they were surrendering that initiative voluntarily. They were doing it because everything they had learned told them it was the safest choice. No order forced them. No threat compelled them. Their own judgment led them there. As these engagements accumulated, something subtle but critical happened within the German submarine force. Confidence eroded, not panicked out. Commanders began to notice that deep evasion was no longer guaranteeing survival. That waiting no longer meant escape. That something about Allied behavior had changed, even if they couldn't see what. But Doctrine offered no alternative. Surfacing to confirm danger was reckless. Staying shallow invited attack. Running fast made noise. Slowing down removed options. Every path forward violated a rule designed to keep them alive. This is when the trap truly closed. Allied escorts were no longer chasing submarines. They were shaping the battle space. They controlled tempo. They controlled positioning. They controlled escalation. And all of it rested on a single assumption planted in the enemy's mind, that visible signs meant real danger. Once that assumption took hold, the enemy did the rest. This wasn't a miracle tactic. It didn't guarantee success every time. Submarine warfare remained dangerous, chaotic, and unforgiving. Balance had shifted. What had once been a game of hide and seek had become a game of pressure and prediction. And in that game, the side that understood behavior held the advantage. The change didn't announce itself dramatically. There was no single battle that declared a new era. Instead, reports began to change tone. Submarines destroyed in shorter engagements. Fewer escorts, exhausting their weapons without result. More confirmed kills where once there had been uncertainty. The mathematics were beginning to turn. The enemy still had capable crews. They still had effective submarines. They still knew how to fight. But they were now fighting inside a mental framework that no longer protected them. And that framework was collapsing faster than anyone on either side fully realized. The consequences of that collapse would soon become visible to the entire war effort. And when they did, historians would give the moment a name. But by then, the decision had already been made. Numbers finally changed. They did so abruptly. Not gradually, not ambiguously, but unmistakably. In the spring of 1943, German submarines began disappearing at a rate no one inside the U-boat arm had prepared for. Patrols that once returned with tonnage reports now failed to return at all. Engagements that should have ended in escape ended in destruction. This period would later be called Black May, and it is often explained in simple terms: better radar, long-range aircraft, improved weapons, broken codes. All of those factors mattered, but they don't explain the timing. Those technologies did not appear overnight. Many had existed for months, even years. What changed in May was not capability, it was outcome. The kill ratio flipped. Submarines that once survived detection were now being destroyed in clusters. Escort groups began reporting multiple confirmed kills in single operations. Convoys passed through areas that had been death traps only weeks earlier without losing a single ship. From the German perspective, the shift was bewildering. Commanders followed Doctrine. They executed correct evasive maneuvers. They avoided unnecessary risk. And still, they were found, not chased. Found. This distinction mattered. Being chased implied agency, movement, uncertainty, escape. Being found implied something else entirely. It implied predictability. The submarine war had crossed an invisible threshold. German commanders were no longer dictating engagements. They were reacting to them. Their choices had narrowed to a set of defensive options that no longer protected them. Dive deeper. Wait longer. Hope the escorts leave. But the escorts didn't. Allied forces had learned that patience favored them now. They no longer needed immediate results. Once a submarine committed to deep evasion, time worked against it. Battery power drained. Air quality deteriorated. Stress accumulated. And above all, the submarine remained blind. Every additional minute spent deep increased vulnerability. What had once been a survival tactic became a countdown. This is why Black May cannot be explained by weapons alone. Weapons destroy targets. Systems create conditions. The condition that changed was decision-making. German commanders were making rational choices based on assumptions that were no longer valid. They believed surface indicators still reflected real pursuit. They believed diving deep still bought safety. Those beliefs had been true until they weren't. Once false trail tactics entered the equation, survival doctrine turned inward on itself. The very procedures designed to preserve submarines now guided them into predictable, exploitable states. The Allies didn't win by overpowering the enemy. They won by letting the enemy overpower himself. This is the part of the story that often goes unnoticed. Black May was not a collapse of courage. German crews continued to fight with discipline and resolve. It was not a collapse of technology. Submarines remained capable machines. It was a collapse of confidence in interpretation. Commanders could no longer trust what they saw. They could no longer trust what Doctrine told them was safe. They could no longer trust that doing the right thing would lead to survival. And in war, uncertainty is lethal. By the end of May 1943, the German Naval Command made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Submarines were withdrawn from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The Atlantic had not become safe, but it had become hostile to submarines. The shift was strategic, not tactical. Germany still had submarines, still had crews, still had the will to fight. But the environment they relied on, predictable enemy behavior, no longer existed. And without that predictability, the submarine force lost its greatest advantage. Black May did not mark the end of submarine warfare. It marked the end of an illusion. The illusion that disciplined doctrine alone could guarantee survival. The illusion that correct procedures could neutralize uncertainty. The illusion that rational systems could not be turned against themselves. What followed would reshape naval warfare far beyond 1943. But the lesson had already been written into the Atlantic. Wars do not turn when one side becomes stronger. They turn when one side understands something the other refuses to question. Black May, the Battle of the Atlantic, never returned to what it had been. The ships were still there. The submarines were still there. The ocean was still vast and unforgiving. But the logic that governed the war at sea had changed. For years, submarine warfare had been understood as a contest of machines, sonar versus stealth, depth charges versus pressure hulls, speed versus silence. Histories focused on technology because technology was visible, measurable, and dramatic. What this story reveals is something quieter. The decisive shift came when one side stopped trying to defeat the enemy's weapons and started understanding the enemy's decisions. False trail tactics were not revolutionary because they were clever. They were revolutionary because they exposed a weakness that had nothing to do with steel or explosives. They exposed belief. German submarine doctrine had been built to eliminate uncertainty. It taught commanders how to respond correctly under pressure. It replaced hesitation with procedure. That discipline had saved countless lives, until it didn't. Once Allied forces learned how those procedures shaped instinct, they no longer needed to outfight the submarine. They only needed to influence the choices it would make when information felt incomplete. The submarine didn't need to be tricked into panic. It only needed to behave exactly as trained. This is why the lesson of floating debris outlived the war itself. In the decades that followed, navies around the world embraced deception not as an accessory, but as a foundation of undersea warfare. Decoys, false signatures, simulated contacts, all of them trace back to the same principle. Control what the enemy believes they are seeing, and you control what they do next. But the deeper lesson goes beyond submarines. Military history often celebrates genius as something rare and distant, the product of brilliant commanders, advanced laboratories, or vast resources. This story suggests something more uncomfortable, that transformative ideas often begin at the edges of systems, with people who are not supposed to be looking for them, in places doctrine has trained everyone else to ignore. The observation that changed the Atlantic didn't come from a strategic mastermind trying to win the war. It came from attention, from noticing a pattern that didn't fit expectations, and from a willingness to ask a question that sounded foolish. And it required something even rarer, a command structure willing to listen. Once that happened, the system turned on itself. The most disciplined submarine force in the world became predictable. Predictability became vulnerability, and vulnerability became defeat. This doesn't mean technology didn't matter. It doesn't mean courage didn't matter. It doesn't mean leadership didn't matter. It means that wars often turn when one side understands the invisible rules the other side never questions. The rules about what counts as information. The rules about what can be ignored. The rules about what makes sense. In 1943, floating trash violated every instinct about what mattered in combat. That is why it worked, because no one trains for the thing they believe is beneath notice. The Atlantic War was not won by garbage. It was won by insight. Insight into how rational people behave under uncertainty. Insight into how systems built to reduce fear can amplify it. Insight into how doing everything right can still lead to disaster. Once you understand that, the story stops being about submarines. It becomes a warning about doctrine, about certainty, about the danger of believing that the world will always behave the way it has before. Because sometimes, the detail that changes everything is the one everyone has learned to look past.